Alright, hey guys, so today I want to talk about this one essay that I've just written, which is called Obliviating Christ and Caesar, the Downfall of Western Civilization, from the perspective of a non-religious Chinese person. So, well, as you can see, since I'm from China and apparently I'm non-religious, so I think my perspective on the Western civilization could be somewhat interesting. So, what kind of got me to think about this topic was actually not from right now, but from a movie that I watched around 7, 8 years ago, which is called Silence, um, starring Liam Neeson and Andrew Garfield. Perhaps you have all heard of this movie. So the background of this movie was during the Christian persecution during the Shogunate era in Japan. So one Jesuit missionary from Portugal, whose name was Father Rodriguez, he was sent to Japan to protect the Christians in Japan, as well as to find his predecessor, whose name was Father Ferreira, also a Jesuit missionary, who disappeared in Japan during this time. So unfortunately, after Father Rodriguez arrived in Japan, he and his followers were caught by the Japanese authority, and he was given eventually two choices. So he would either denounce himself from Christianity to save his Japanese believers, or he sticks with his Christian faith and let his Japanese believers die. And in the end, Father Rodriguez chose the former because, in his opinion, the nature of Christianity is about love instead of merely believing God himself. So, in the end, he made the same choice as what Father Ferreira did all these years ago, which was also to denounce his Christian faith in order to save his Japanese followers. So, up until now, probably you would think about this story as a Christian denouncing his faith and stuff. But interestingly, at the end of the film, when Father Rodriguez died and he got cremated in the Japanese fashion, in his hand he was actually holding secretly a cross, a wooden cross, which signals that even to the end of his life, he was sticking to his faith as a Christian. So what I understood from this film was that the essence of Christianity was never about believing in Jesus or not, but rather about love, resilience, and selflessness, which actually, coincidentally, is also the kind of value that we hold in traditional Chinese culture, and these are also the exact same values which form the foundation of Western society. So why do I say, from my perspective, that believing in God or Jesus is not the most important thing about being a Christian? Because if you think about it this way, the God, or Jehovah, he exists in all the Abrahamic religions, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And also, speak of Jesus, he is considered also as a prophet in Islam as well. So let's say if you are a Christian and you're saying the only thing you care about Christianity is believing God or Jesus, then in comparison to the other Abrahamic religions, that doesn't make you anything special at all. So the important question that we should be asking ourselves was, how did Christianity separate from Judaism in the first place? Because if we think about it this way, so Judaism and the Old Testament focused a lot on obeying the God, as well as the severe consequence of disobeying God, which we have both seen in scenarios, for example, from the Great Flooding or when Moses left Egypt. And therefore, according to the Old Testament and Judaism, it focuses more about how Jews are the chosen people by God, and therefore by essence, it's more exclusive. And if we look at Christianity and the New Testament, it focuses more about bringing salvation to the world and ending misery and injustice in the reality, which of course, given the historical context, was the rule under the Roman Empire. So it also claims that all nation who worships God could become the chosen people. And therefore, the essence of Christianity is, in comparison to Judaism, more non-exclusive and universal. Now, of course, there will be also a lot of Christians that are proud of themselves being Christians because they're being monotheistic and therefore worshiping only God and Jesus. And this is especially common among the early Christians who really distinguish themselves from the pagans in this sense. But then, if we look at the history of monotheistic religion, it actually started all the way back in the ancient Egyptian era when Pharaoh Akhenaten made his own religious reform. And therefore, if you're proud about yourself being a Christian only from the perspective that you're being monotheistic, so why don't you worship Aten, which was the ancient Egyptian god created by Akhenaten? Because after all, he is also an almighty God, no less powerful than Jehovah. So in this case, simply being monotheistic as well does not make you any special. So by all means, Christianity started off as a good faith, but unfortunately, throughout the course of history and the development of Christianity itself, a lot of Christians, they start to shift their focus merely on converting others into Christians and persecuting whoever doesn't. And at the same time, they tend to forget about the essence of Christianity, which was in the end the virtuous deeds of Jesus and the Holy Family, and as well as the lessons that one could learn from these deeds. Because if we look at the deeds of Jesus and the Holy Family, many of them are absolutely relatable to the modern world. For example, we've heard a lot of stories of Jesus saving people from famine and disease. And isn't this what exactly doctors, first aid workers, and scientists would do in the modern world? Jesus also saved the poor people from injustice, and this is what exactly a good judge and legislator would do in the modern world. When Jesus was arrested, he remained calm, and he didn't betray any of his apostles to seek for his own survival or anything. And this is the kind of loyalty which is very rare among modern world as well. And also, the Holy Family, apparently in order to escape the persecution of King Herod, they went into exile in Egypt for 3 years. And I think anyone in the modern world who had backgrounds of immigration and refugee would understand this struggle. So as we can see, Christianity provided a lot of spiritual values and spiritual comfort to people. So if Christianity focuses more on the spiritual aspect, then on the other hand, the culture of classical antiquity provided people with more factual and intellectual perspectives through which people could be taught and educated. So for example, we have philosophy, the Stoicism from Marcus Aurelius, which could teach you how to be a moral person. We have classic art and sculpture, which inspires your appreciation towards beauty. We have a lot of classical history books, historians, for example, Herodotus and Plutarch, who makes great records of history so that people could learn from the lessons from history. And there are also epics like Iliad and Odyssey, which cultivates and arouses human emotions. So as we can see, Christianity and classical culture are the two main bases of the Western culture. And therefore, all the aforementioned virtues and great lessons from history, they are also part of the Western cultural basis. And indeed, back in the days when Christianity and classical culture were still dominant in the West, we do actually hear a lot of role model figures and a lot of quite virtuous deeds as well. So some of those virtuous figures are actually very well known to people. So for example, Desmond Doss, who was the main character from Hacksaw Ridge, who was also, by coincidence, a Christian himself, refused to carry a weapon amidst the heat of battle, yet he saved 75 men from death. We also have the Christmas Truce of 1914, where soldiers from Britain, France, and Germany decided to stop the carnage of the First World War, get out their trenches, and celebrate Christmas together. And not to mention, as we see from Titanic, how the men decided to let themselves die and let the women and children have the chance to live. So as a Chinese, many of these tales are actually very well known to us as well. And in fact, many of them, we've heard them since our childhood. And I would say, although that we are indeed from a very different culture, however, we do deeply admire and relate to these virtues because, after all, what these Western virtues also echoes from the traditional virtues from our own civilization. So let's say, for example, during the Battle of Waterloo, Lord Uxbridge, who was actually the deputy officer of the Duke of Wellington, he was hit by a cannonball and he had to be amputated. And surprisingly, he remained calm and elegant during this whole process that when he was being amputated, even joking with other people about it. And this to me sounded quite similar to one of the stories in our history. So one of our most famous generals from antiquity, whose name is Guan Yu, he was once shot by a poisonous arrow in battle, and as a result, he had to be treated by cutting open all his flesh, so that the doctor could use a small blade to get rid of the poisons on his skeleton. And yet, while he was doing this, while the surgery was going on, he was actually having a drink with his friend, as well as playing, let's say, a type of chess with him. And so, for me, what General Guan Yu did was not so different from, to be honest, what Lord Uxbridge was behaving while being amputated. And again, another example with classical history would be Xenophon's Anabasis, where the Greek general Xenophon led his 10,000 men march from the hinterland of Persia all the way back to Greece. And this pretty much reminds me of the Great Long March by the Chinese Red Army in the 1930s, which, despite many people who might not like communism or everything, but still, you cannot deny the fact that the Long March was a great miracle in human history. And also, the traditional Christian family values, they definitely echoes those of the traditional Chinese family value, because in the end, it's about love among the family and about caring your kids and your family. So for a long time, we Chinese do look quite highly upon the Western civilization. And the reason for which is not just because they're wealthier or stronger than us back in the days, but more because we believe that these countries upheld a higher moral standard, and therefore making them, from a certain perspective, more civilized than us. But as a Chinese who was living in Europe, Germany, in the 2020s, I realized that in fact, much of those values, those Western traditional values that we look upon, are actually now being slowly abandoned in the West. And as a replacement, what comes are things like political correctness, extreme individualism and hedonism, denouncement of Christian values, and disrespect towards the Western culture and history in general. And sadly, as a result, most of the young people in the West, especially Western Europe, I would say, they just simply don't know what to believe anymore, and they ended up becoming very empty-minded and without any pursuit and moral. So let's take individualism and hedonism as an example. So we Chinese, we are fully aware of the fact that the Western culture focuses more on individualism and the pursuit of happiness. And we do consider this as a good addition to our own culture because, as you probably know, our culture focuses more on collectivism and hard work. But however, we do also believe in social order, responsibility towards the family and society, so we totally acknowledge the fact that there is no such thing as absolute freedom, because it will only bring absolute disorder. So the modern Western individualism, as what we would have understood, was more about protecting personal freedom, pursuit of dreams, and the achievement of personal values. And yet in reality, what Western individualism had become is actually selflessness, egoism, and irresponsibility. So in short, you think only about yourself and you don't care about others. And as one of the manifestations of this kind of moral decline, one can definitely see it from dating, actually. So, with modern dating, one can disengage contact with the other person whenever they feel like it, and probably without even a proper reason, which led to the fact that ghosting and sudden breakups has become such a common practice and making modern dating way more traumatizing than any time in the history in the past. And as a result, so many people live in a Western society, they feel lonely and depressed, and most likely end up being single and miserable as they get old. So many people would argue that it's unfair to demand ordinary people to uphold such high moral value because they were never educated in these values, or at least such values are not being promoted by the mainstream culture. But then, think about it. Is this really true? Is the mainstream culture really not promoting anything good? Let's take Star Wars, for example. In Star Wars, it also talked about being selfless, as we can see from the Jedi Order, the Jedi Way, and in the philosophy of Jedi and Sith, we can see what good and evil is. And this is something so obvious that even a child could understand. Yet most people, when they talk about Star Wars, they refuse to see the philosophical meanings behind Star Wars and would rather just think about it as something very nerdy. And so what I'm saying here is the promotion of moral values in mainstream culture, of course, they always exist. It's just that the people refuse to see it and acknowledge it and just pretend that they don't exist. And let's not forget, many of the cultural origins of Star Wars actually lies in Christianity and classical culture. So for example, the birth of Anakin Skywalker is almost identical as the Christ's birth from Virgin Mary. And the role of Anakin Skywalker as the chosen one is similar to the fact that Christ being the chosen one to bring salvation to the mankind. And if you look closely to Anakin's personality and image, it's very identical to that of Alexander the Great. Not just the blonde hair, of course, but also the fact that he's an emotional general, a great general, of course. And the Jedi way of being selflessness, it's quite similar to Christ's willingness to sacrifice himself to save the mankind. And also in Star Wars, you will see various Latin names. For example, Venator-class Star Destroyer, the planets of Mortis and Scipio. And the transformation from the Galactic Republic to the Empire echoes basically the fall of the Roman Republic and transition to the Roman Empire. So what I'm saying is that anyone with a common sense of Christianity, Christian culture, and Western history would be able to see those connections and links. And it's definitely not something sophisticated. So the main question here is, so under the Western context, can you be a very moral person while completely denouncing Christian values? So theoretically, maybe, but I would say it's highly unlikely. Because if you think about it this way, so being caring and selfless is a Christian value. And therefore, in a way, it's holy and unoffendable because it's under the witness of the God. So let's say if you don't believe in any form of God, or you completely despise the idea that any form of God or supernatural force exists, you would have no fear of any form of divine judgment or punishment or supernatural intervention or anything. And so in this case, what could really stop you from being selfish and not to hurt other people? Just your good mood or something? I don't think so. So now you'll probably be asking me, what about China? So China is not a Christian country, and not even such a religious country. So according to you, should Chinese people all be savages? So my answer to this question would be, well, first of all, indeed we are not a Christian country. Our first contact with Christianity was in Tang Dynasty, which was back in the 8th and 9th century, and was in the form of Nestoricism. And our mass contact with Christianity only started in Ming Dynasty, following the arrival of European missionaries. However, what we do have is the Confucian philosophy, which had been around since 3,000 years. And it has already been closely embedded into our traditional values. And on top of that, so in terms of religion, almost every Chinese believes in something called Tian, which literally is translated into sky or heaven. So the sky and heaven, from as what we see, is a form of divine power, just like God. So, and actually, just like God, Jehovah, the heaven does not have a physical form. So, therefore, I would say as Chinese, we don't really rely on religion to uphold our moral standard. So, in comparison, we rely mainly on traditional philosophy. And on top of that, we do have our natural respect towards religious ideas. So, I would say the combined force of these two is pretty much good enough for us to uphold our moral. So, due to our attitude towards religion, we Chinese, we do have a natural respect towards religions actually. As a matter of fact, if you go to China nowadays, you can see worshippers of almost every religion. And even if you're not religious, many of the non-religious people also go to religious venues. For example, Christian churches and Buddhist temples to pray to God and the Buddha. So for me as a Chinese, I am always curious and interested in knowing about other religions, and especially towards religions that has a moral value behind it, because these are religions that makes me feel more respectful. And in this sense, I would say that I also respect people who uphold beliefs to restrain themselves, because in the end, it's not about if you go to church every Sunday or how many times do you pray to God every day. What's important here is that you do value these good virtues that makes you a good person. So from what I'm seeing right now, I will see the West is now going through a phase of abandoning its own culture. And as a Chinese, I would say it's quite ironic for me to see it, because it feels like, in a way, the West is going through the Cultural Revolution right now, which, as Chinese, we know all too well of. And unfortunately for the West, since they have not yet went through such historical phases yet, and I guess maybe this is why that for the West, they simply don't understand the destruction behind such behavior. Because in China, we do notice one thing, that the people who grew up during the era of Cultural Revolution, as well, especially those who used to be Red Guards themselves, they do actually grow up having lower moral values, and it has actually been a problem to our society for quite a long time due to all the bad behaviors from these people. So we've learned the lesson from our own historical mistakes, and I'm very glad that we went through that time of confusion already, so that we would not do the same mistake again. So now you might think that I'm exaggerating the situation, because apparently the Western society is still functioning pretty well right now, and the decline of Christian values is not such a big thing. But actually, such abandonment of Christian value is manifesting in many things very closely related to your everyday life. And one of the biggest problems right now is, for example, the chaos in the dating market, which, as I've mentioned earlier, this thing with ghosting and everything. But actually, in terms of dating and the decline of the traditional values, the more essential question here is, why do you even date? And what are you looking for from dating? So back in the days, almost everyone date in order to find a lifelong partner, because back in the days, everyone wants to get married and have a family and have kids, because this is simply what the traditional Christian value asks you to do. And nowadays, with the rise of feminism and individualism, many people, sadly especially women, they do not want to have families or kids at all, because they consider this as a burden to their career and life in general. So as a result, for many people, the whole aim of dating has changed. From finding a partner to just dating with confusing intentions, which could mean a lot of things. For example, it could be for fun, for attention, out of boredom, to forget about a traumatizing past relationship, or sometimes just not knowing at all what they're here for. And most ironically, even for those people who think that they know what they're dating for, their reasons for dating could still be quite delusional. And I'm saying this from my personal experience, because once I went on a date with a woman in her late 30s, and despite the fact that we had a very good connection, she refused to even hold hands during the date. And what she told me, basically, why she was dating, was because she wants to find a man who could commit to her wholeheartedly, and yet, from her side, she would want neither marriage nor kids with this man. So, I don't know, how is that possible? So the conclusion that I'm getting here is that a lot of people nowadays, they don't date in order to find a partner, but rather they date for personal pleasure, which, in my opinion, is simply an approach that would not work. Because, first of all, what is pleasure? So, in my opinion, pleasure is that you get something that you want through a certain degree of effort. And therefore, you have to first know exactly what do you want. But then, on the other hand, if you don't know exactly what you want, you can never be satisfied. And in this case, by essence, you can never get pleasure. So, since most people who date for pleasure do not actually know what they want from dating, and therefore, it only makes sense that they could never get the pleasure that they expect from dating, at least not in a sustainable way. And also, from another perspective, I actually think that the approach of dating for pleasure actually makes it harder for you to find a suitable partner because this approach really changes the way how you perceive a person that you date. So, first of all, there's a basic common sense. No one is perfect, okay? So, therefore, the so called perfect partner does not exist. So, let's say if you want to find a serious partner, okay, when it comes to dating, so you always try to discover the good thing about this person. And you try to, well, of course, maybe he has some downsides, but you will try to tolerate it, or you try to help him overcome his downsides. But then, when you date for pleasure, your focus shifts more on discovering the negative side of this person, and you would call it the red flags, of course. And so, basically, once you see something you don't like, you would just quit whenever you feel uncomfortable. And therefore, it actually makes it harder for you to find a partner because if you are looking for something bad about this person, in the end, you can always find some flaws. So, in general, if you date for pleasure, it will just make you more impatient and less tolerant when it comes to building connection and trust with people, which will, in the end, completely damage your whole status or your whole mindset on dating. And now comes the part where you might potentially call me a sexist, but it's okay, not a problem. So, what I'm saying is that this confusion with dating is, of course, harming both men and women. But in comparison, it's definitely harming women way more. Because, unfortunately, men can always date younger women. So, and also their fertility ability does not get affected that much as they age. But for women, dating younger men is always trickier as they get older, and of course their fertility gets decreased way more drastically as they get aged. So basically, for a woman in their twenties is probably the best time for them to find a partner, and then form a stable relationship before they start to age. And yet, in reality, so many women choose to just have fun in their 20s, dating around without any purpose, and wishes to continue to have fun until the day that they cannot have fun anymore, which is usually when it's too late for them to realize. And unfortunately, when it comes to that point, they usually already end up old without marriage and family. So the irony here is that I'm actually not that worried about how the next generation of Europeans or Westerners would be like. I'm more worried if the next generation of Europeans or Westerners would even exist due to lack of marriage. So apparently what the West is experiencing right now, it's complete chaos. But then on the other hand, maybe this is in the end what the West is looking for. Because the West has been living in peace and comfort for such a long time. And people start to just get bored of it. And they're so bored that they forgot about the days when the world was at war, when Europe was ravaged by the First and Second World War, and decided to just pursue for some chaos to make their lives more fun. And which is actually why, for example, in Germany, so many people are obsessed with Latino culture. And by Latino culture, I'm saying, to be more specifically, Central American and Northern South American culture, which very ironically for the Southern Americans, for example, Argentinians, Chileans, Uruguayans, they could actually not relate to it at all. And for me as a Chinese, it's also very hard for me to relate. Not because I have anything against Latino culture, but it's just in China, we tend to be more interested in the more successful countries and cultures, which means the countries and cultures that are stronger and more orderly. And this is actually exactly what happens when the West decide to abandon Christian and classical culture. Because after all, both the Church and the Roman Empire, they both emphasize highly on order and stability. So again, back to the chaos in dating, which is a manifestation of Europe abandoning the traditional cultures. So this abandonment of traditional value actually promotes the behavior of dating for pleasure, because in the traditional Christian value, for example, it's always the monogamous family, and in the classical culture, in back in the Roman and Greek times, of course, polygamous families are also tolerated. But what both have in common is that in the end, they both emphasize on the creation of a family, and therefore raising the new generation. And as a result, when it comes to dating, in most cases, back in the days, you look for quality in the person that makes him or her a good spouse and partner, or husband and wife. So, for example, you will probably look for traits like responsibility, stability, intelligence, reliability, etc. And in the end, these are all the traits that could lead to the establishment of a family. But then, with modern culture, they say that marriage and family is unnecessary because it's a so-called oppression on female. And therefore, women no longer look for traits when it comes to dating from men that could lead to the creation of a family. And therefore, they focus more, or let's say they're more interested in traits that indicates, let's say, aggression, toxicity, recklessness, and primitiveness, because these traits somehow make men look more fun, more interesting, and therefore lead to more pleasure. Which, with this kind of approach, it naturally leads to more toxic relationships, as it can be so often now seen nowadays, which makes love and marriage even harder. So I think the essential question here is, do we as human really need love in the end? And is love really an oppression towards women? So I can only say my opinion. I think love is very necessary, and it has nothing to do with gender, because both men and women need them. So a woman need love and marriage from men, just as much as how a man need love and marriage from a woman. And because if you think about it, the nature of love and marriage is basically providing each other with both emotional and, of course, material support, so that you don't feel like that you have to deal or face with everything by yourself. And I will say this is simply a basic human desire, and yeah, and it has nothing to do with how developed a society is. But now the sad thing is that since modern culture always tells women to be strong and independent by not falling in love, women would rather allow themselves right now to stay single or in a toxic relationship, which of course most likely resulted from dating for pleasure, and get overwhelmed and depressed, which is especially the case in Germany, rather than to really try to find a man who they could trust and connect with. So basically, trust, as we know, as the foundation of love and marriage, is actually what gets damaged most by this dating for pleasure approach. Because by dating for pleasure, you need to first of all go through a lot of dramas and playing mind games and stuff before you would feel like you could actually accept this person. And but the thing is, like, after all these games and tricks and stuff, trust would have been completely damaged already. So because the thing is, like, trust is something that needs time to build, and it's very fragile, especially in the beginning. So, and of course it can also break at any time by anything. So once it's broken, it would take a lot of effort to build it up again, if it's even possible. So in general, trust is something that really takes a lot of effort to maintain. So, yeah, I would say it's very ridiculous that many people actually think that in order to get a good relationship, you need to first go through all these gaming, destroying the trust, and then you could somehow miraculously fall in love with each other. So apparently nobody is enjoying the situation, and apparently a lot of people are suffering from it. So why don't anyone want to change the situation and just bring back some of the more traditional values or approaches towards dating? So I think on the one hand, in my opinion, it's hard for people to fight the society just by yourself. So in general, people tend to, in the end, adapt to society. And also, on the other hand, due to, of course, as we all know, political correctness, people are afraid of being conservative. And it seems that if you talk about bringing back the traditional values, it would make you somehow look more conservative. But why are people afraid of being conservative? Because in the modern context, we tend to relate the word conservative with someone that's more immoral or inhumane, while we tend to associate liberal with someone more moral and humane. But the thing is it really true? Or is it more like a generalization? And I will say it's more a generalization and a stereotype, because I can say this from my personal experience. So, as you know, I live in Freiburg, and this is a city where most people claim to be liberal and open. And yet, in this city, I don't feel like I'm being so welcomed. And in fact, through my, of course, again, through my own personal experience, I think some of the most open-minded and friendly people that I've ever met, they tend to be a bit more conservative in some ways. You know, especially let's say in terms of valuing traditional values and not being so receptive towards the modern woke culture and stuff. And on the other hand, many very radical liberal and alternative people that I've met, they tend to be way harder to get along with. So the main difference here is that open-minded conservative people, they acknowledge differences between nations and cultures. And therefore, when they meet someone from a different background, they try to find common ground which they could connect with each other. While on the other hand, the close-minded liberals, they tend to judge others based on their differences and ultimately requires others become the same as them, or otherwise, they would just see the others as foes. And therefore, in liberal-oriented cities, like Freiburg for example, they tend to make people, including liberals themselves, feel depressed because one always lives under the constant fear of being judged. And therefore, they also feel the need to judge others. So basically, you don't feel secure to open up to people and because you don't want to be judged. And you find it hard to trust others because, again, you would feel that once you reveal your true thoughts, you will be judged and people will turn against you. And therefore, to avoid this from happening, you have to force yourself to adapt to all the liberal values just so that you can fit in and not ending up becoming isolated.